Well, hello everybody. My name is Trey Munoz, and I'm very excited for today's message. And the title of today's message is going to be A Man After His Own Heart. And we're going to be looking at the story of David and Bathsheba. And we're going to examine his life and see what mistakes did he make that we can avoid. How can we do better in our dating and our relationships, in our romantic relationships? And I want us to specifically look at his lack of boundaries and the way in which he just toppled them over one after the other. Because none of us are above that. That's what this story is trying to teach us. David wasn't some rebel. He was the man after God's own heart. And as we read this story, I want us to read it with the knowledge of who David is. Because that's what makes it so shocking. There are certain stories that are supposed to come to mind when we think about them. Stories like David and Goliath, where while the entire army of Israel was shaken in their boots, he went out and he fought for God and he won. The story of David and Saul, where he was in a cave and he had the perfect opportunity to strike him down, and yet he didn't. He said, "How can I put my hand to the Lord's anointed?" Talk about boundaries. Talk about godliness. So when we read this story of David and Bathsheba, it's supposed to shock us. It's supposed to fly in the face of everything we expect to happen, because none of it should have happened. And it's declaring for everyone to hear, no one's too good to fall like he did. We're not exempt from the rules. We're not too strong for boundaries, because it's that way of thinking that led David to fall like he did. And so today, I want us to see what happens when he got into a relationship and decided to take things into his own hands, to do what he saw as best. And I want us to see how he ruined that relationship. This is the story of David and Bathsheba. Now, before we get into it, let me catch you up to speed. At this point in time, David is king of Israel, and he's doing a great job. The nation's expanding, it's growing wealthier, he's leading them in godliness. Everything is going great. And then you get to chapter 11, and that's going to be our text. 2 Samuel chapter 11, we're starting with verse 1, where we see a rooftop romance. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth into battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. The author, he's giving us the timeline. He's telling us when this took place, and he's saying it's in the spring, the beginning of the Israelite year, when the cold and rainy months had passed away. It's finally warm enough for an army to go and fight. And because of this was the normal time for kings to go to war. And that's what's happening here. Israel is at war, so the general is sent. The mighty men are sent. Every able-bodied man in all of Israel is sent. Everyone's sent. Everyone goes. Everyone except David. And the text is practically screaming at us that there's something wrong with this. At the time when kings go out to battle, this king stayed home. He's not leading the troops or marching alongside them. He's hanging out at the palace. Notice he's not where he's supposed to be. He's not doing what he's supposed to do. And because of that, while they're out fighting a war, he'll fight one within himself. He's already laying the groundwork for what comes next. 2 Samuel 11 verse 2. And it came to pass in the evening tide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Now there are some weird things about this passage in our culture. We don't understand them very well. First of all, why is David getting out of bed in the evening? Well, first of all, this was actually more like 3 o'clock. The time when the sun was starting to go down and the hottest part of the day was past. And this was actually very common in that part of the world, and still is. During the hottest part of the day, you'd escape the heat by going inside and getting some rest. That's what David's doing. It's an Israelite siesta. And when he got up, he did what many Jews did at the time. He went and he walked upon the roof. This flat surface that functioned more like a living room, where up there you could feel the breeze, you could chill, hang out, relax, and look at the city. There's just one thing. David's roof was higher than anyone else's. He was at the top of the hill, and because of that, he could see what no one else could. And that's what's happening here. David's not looking at some woman bathing in public. He's likely seeing a woman in the enclosed courtyard of her home. Because they didn't have indoor plumbing or bathhouses. If you were washing yourself, you'd go out into your courthouse, or your courtyard, stand in a basin, dump a container of water over your head, and start scrubbing. That was the best you could do. This was the normal way to bathe at the time. But David, unlike everyone else, could see everything. He could see over those walls. The problem is he didn't just see her, he kept looking. There was no eye bouncing going on. He thought she was beautiful. He liked what he saw, so he kept looking. But it doesn't stop there. 2 Samuel 11, 3-4. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her. And she came in unto him, and he lay with her. For she is purified from her uncleanness. And she returned unto her house. David knows nothing about her. He knows she's beautiful, and she lives over there. But he wanted her. He saw her, he liked her, and now he said, "Go and get her." He began to ask about her, and someone apparently recognized her. "Oh, yeah, that's Bathsheba, Uriah's wife." Sorry, let me rephrase that. She's married. But that didn't stop him. David didn't care because he liked what he saw, so he had his servants go get her, and he slept with her. It just keeps getting worse. This shouldn't be happening, but then the author interrupts the story to give us a very important, very weird detail. And says, "For she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house." Now that's a weird thing to say about a person. She was purified from her uncleanness. But it's actually very important. What this is telling us is that bath she was taking was not just any bath. It was the bath that a woman would take at the end of her menstrual cycle to become ceremonially, ritually clean. But it's also telling us very important, something else that's very important. And that is that because of the timing, if she were to become pregnant, it could only be from David. He's setting us up for this next verse. 11 verse 5. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, "I am with child." Now I know we're reading a story, but I want you to imagine what David would have felt like in that moment. I want you to imagine the craziness that would have gone through his head. Imagine the scene. It's probably been a few weeks. David's been doing his own thing when he gets a message from Bathsheba. "Hey, by the way, I hope you're doing well. Just so you know, I'm pregnant." And I can imagine his heart started to beat a little faster. And I can imagine he got nervous, he got scared, he didn't know what to do. Suddenly, David's one-night stand got a whole lot more complicated. And I'm sure he was freaking out, but he throws the plan together, and here we're introduced to Uriah. The snowball just keeps going, it keeps getting worse. And that's verses 6-13 where we see a warrior's nobility. Now let's read 6-9. And David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah was come unto him, David demanded of him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. He's making small talk. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to thy house, wash thy feet." And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and went not down to his house. David's saying, "Okay, great. Thanks for the update. I really appreciate your help getting me all updated on what's going on with the war. Now I'm going to keep you in town for a while. So why don't you relax? Go on home, get some rest, enjoy your wife." And Uriah walks out the door. You can almost imagine David giving a sigh of relief. Oh, he fell for it. Uriah's going to go home, sleep with his wife, and think he's the father. This is great. It's all working out. It's all going according to plan. There's just one issue. Uriah doesn't go home, but sleeps in front of the palace doors. That's where we get to verses 10 through 11. And when they had told David, saying, Uriah went not down unto his house, David said unto Uriah, Camest thou not from thy journey? Why then didst thou not go down unto thine house? And Uriah said unto David, The ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest, and as my soul liveth, I will not do this thing. David's probably pretty frustrated by now. And his plan is falling apart. So he says, dude, you've been at war, sleeping on the ground. Why on earth would you not want to sleep in your own bed next to your wife? It's a fair question. You'd expect him to go home after being at war for probably a month or so at this point. And yet he doesn't. But here's Uriah's answer, and it is frustratingly perfect. It probably made David want to scream. He says, how can I go home and pretend there's not a war going on when my friends, my people, and the ark of the Lord are out in some field? He's saying, I can't enjoy life here because this isn't where I'm supposed to be. That is scary bold. Because the implicit question behind Uriah's response is, as king, how can you do it? How can you stay here in this palace while we're out fighting? How are you so comfortable? But Uriah doesn't stop there. He keeps going and says, I swear on your life and my own, this is a boundary I won't cross. Where we get to our next passage, verses 12 to 13. And David said to Uriah, tarry here today also, and tomorrow I will let thee depart. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. And when David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but went not down to his house. David's trying everything. He's trying to buy himself some time. He's tried gifts. He's tried persuasion. Now this is his last hope. He's going to get him drunk and hope he can persuade him to go home. As we read this passage, we learn that this fails too. But this is really crazy if you think about it. Because what the text is telling us is that while drunk, Uriah showed more self-control towards his own wife than David did. That he was a better man drunk than David was sober. Because he had boundaries that he wouldn't cross. He was noble. He was brave. He was bold. And he would rather sleep on the stone floor than go against his convictions. And that deserves respect, but that's not what David gives him. And in verses 14 through 17, we see a king's depravity. And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. And it came to pass, when Joab observed the city, that he assigned Uriah unto a place where he knew that valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab. And there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. In an attempt to cover it all up, David turns to killing this man who had fought alongside him and had devoted his life to protecting him, someone whose only crime was not breaking the boundaries David already had. And here Uriah is still doing his job honorably. He is carrying his letter of execution, but he doesn't even stop to look inside and see what it says. But he delivers it faithfully. And when he's told to attack the strongest part of the wall, he does it, and he dies doing it. But notice he's not the only one who dies because of David's command. Other men were sent with him to keep it from looking suspicious. They didn't want it to look bad. And they died too, fighting for a king who had signed their death warrants. Everything about this is unfair. Like, when you look at this passage, Uriah didn't deserve that. He was good. He was brave. He seemed so amazing, such a great husband, and yet this is what his end is? But it gets worse. And in verses 26 and 27, we see a wife's mourning. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now, we don't know how long she mourned for. Many commentators believe it was around a week, which was the normal length of time for grieving at the time. And after that, David married her. He got what he wanted. He covered up the scandal. He made sure it never got out. And it sounds like the ending of a story. But then there's one more line. It displeased the Lord. And with it, the author is telling us that's not over yet, that this won't be a happy ending. Because even though no one else knew, God did. And he wasn't happy about it. And that's how the story ends, tragedy upon tragedy, with a hint that more tragedy is coming. What a mess. What a disaster of a love story. And it didn't just affect him, it affected his whole family. His children, his wife, of course. Now, don't get me wrong, God redeems it later on. The prophet Nathan confronts him and he repents and writes Psalm 51, which is so beautiful and heartfelt. But there's a whole lot of tragedy and a whole lot of pain that happens first and after. There are still consequences to it. And tonight I want to ask the question, what did David do that we can learn from? And I think there are 3 major points to point out. If you want to destroy your relationships, follow David's destructive example. First of all, underestimate the danger of idleness. The worst part of this story is that it didn't have to happen. Not just because David could have looked away, but because he never should have been there in the first place. He was supposed to be at war, fighting alongside his men, or at least leading them. But instead, he was taking afternoon naps and rooftop strolls. He was doing nothing important. Oh yeah, and stealing his soldier's wife. He was doing nothing when he should have been doing something, which is called idleness, and it is destructive for life in general, but especially in dating. Because idleness gives temptation opportunity. I know for me and my wife, when we were dating, the most tempting moments in our relationship were never when we were doing something. It was when we were at the house doing nothing. Because temptation comes strongest not when you're busy, but when you're bored. And we see that with David. Idleness did what Saul, Goliath, and danger never could. It caused him to fall, and to fall hard. I'm sure all of us have experienced that at some point. I know I have. I know I sometimes still do. Because when we're inactive, idle, and bored, we're literally sitting ducks for the devil, and you can bet he's going to take his shot, just like he did with David. And if David can fall, who are we? But idleness doesn't just give us opportunities for temptation, it also robs us of our effectiveness. Idleness by its very nature is a disregard of responsibility. We can't get done what we need to when we choose to sit by and be idle. So what's the application here? Don't neglect your responsibilities and don't embrace idleness. You and I as Christians have a mission, and it's supposed to be what we're living for. Idleness gets in the way of that. In our lives, but especially in our relationships. So many young adults today are entering relationships not because they're seeking a spouse, but because they're bored. And they think dating will change that. They feel like they're missing something in life, and if only they had someone, things would be different. They'd be more responsible, be more consistent, and be less bored. But listen, dating isn't for the bored, because the purpose of dating isn't to relieve us of boredom, it's to develop a relationship towards marriage that resembles Christ and his church. It's selfless, not selfish. And when we treat it that way and set our hope for change in it, it will always end up in destruction. So many people are entering relationships while simultaneously ignoring the spiritual responsibilities they already have. Dating won't change that. It'll likely only make it worse. Because the answer for the correction for spiritual idleness is never more distraction. Secondly, blatantly disregard all boundaries. What amazes me about this story is that David crossed boundaries he never should have even been close to. Mentally, first of all, looking at that woman, lusting after her. He may not have known who she belonged to, may not have known her husband, but he knew this: what he was doing was wrong. And he was allowing in images and thoughts that had no business being there. Secondly, he disregarded marital sanctity. She was married. That should have stopped him fast in his tracks, but instead, when he found out he'd sent her husband to war, he only took advantage of his absence. There was no respect for the boundaries of marriage. Application? This is the application for it, because David thought that boundaries got in the way of what he wanted. Don't think that way. In reality, we can now see that each of these boundaries were protecting him from what came next. They weren't raining on his parade, but keeping him from destroying his life. Although I'm sure that's not how it felt in the moment. Just like that's often not how it feels for us. But the boundaries that God's Word lays out for us in dating, sex, lust, porn, even money, and time and discipline, they're for our protection. Not to rob us of enjoyment, but to give us real freedom. David wasn't free in this story. He was a slave to his desires, something his boundaries had kept in check. Real freedom requires boundaries, because they're what keep us safe. But now comes the questions: how do we form them? Because boundaries don't just appear when we get into a relationship. No, we enter relationships with the boundaries we've already created. Meaning that your boundaries in dating will only be as strong as the rest of your boundaries already are. Which makes sense when you think about it, because boundaries are only hard to keep because they require discipline, which isn't natural for us. So if discipline is our issue, then we'll struggle with whatever boundaries we set until the issue is addressed. Meaning this: address the issue. That's your application. It starts by developing boundaries in those small and seemingly insignificant areas of life. The areas we so often overlook, because if we're lacking them in our friendships, our relationships with our parents, finances, health, or in being able to say no, even when it's to ourselves, why on earth would we imagine that dating would be any different? So practice them consistently, and as you do, your boundaries will grow stronger. I'm not saying you'll be perfect. We all have areas we need to improve on, but we should be improving and growing towards this. Because even outside of dating, the stronger our boundaries are, the healthier our relationships will be. And so the question is, how strong are your boundaries? Because the answer to that question will tell you how ready you are to be dating. And the stakes are high. Because as David shows us, when we venture outside of our boundaries in dating, we make ourselves vulnerable to destruction. And that's the last thing any of us want. Third,